Behind my house lies a forest, and within that forest there is a trail that stretches from one end to the other. I discovered this trail not long after I had moved into my house. I was lounging out back one day while my dog Rex ran around the backyard. After a few moments, I realized that I could no longer hear the skittering sounds of Rex running back and forth. I sat up and looked around. Sure enough, he was gone. I called out Rex's name, and within a couple of seconds, I heard distant barking originating from within the woods. Fearing that he may have gotten injured, I quickly jumped up from my chair and ran towards the trees. When I reached the tree line, I noticed a break in the foliage. It was hard to see from a distance, but up close it was unmistakable. The gap in the woods led to a much larger path which seemed to stretch from east to west. I ventured inward onto the trail, whistling and calling for Rex. Thankfully, I found him a couple minutes later. He was a little off the trail having a standoff with a very cocky raccoon. I couldn't help but laugh as I realized that the raccoon was actually winning. I called Rex over to my side and he accepted defeat. I'm not certain, but it seemed like the raccoon huffed triumphantly before waddling off into the underbrush. At this point, I was able to stop and admire the scenery around me. I began walking along the path with Rex by my side. The colorful autumn leaves against the sunlight gave the entire forest a golden appearance. The sound of leaves rustling overhead as a gust of wind passed by filled my ears. I watched Rex playfully run from one side of the path to the other, sniffing and exploring. We walked for 20 minutes before I decided it was time to head back. I called Rex and he followed along as we slowly made our way towards the house. After nearly a half hour of walking, I found the break in the tree line that led to my backyard. Since that day, I've taken Rex on a walk through the woods at least once a week. The walk usually happens on my day off from work since I only get one a week anyways. The day starts off by me being violently awoken by Rex shoving me over and over again. He has become accustomed to these walks and has learned the routine. I eventually stir from my sleep and start getting ready. I perform my usual morning activities, get dressed, and eat before running some errands. When I get back from my trip into town, I change into my boots and open the back door. Rex flies out of the door at 100 miles per hour, and I follow slowly behind. Thankfully, Rex is pretty well trained by this point and has learned to wait for me before going into the woods. He stands at the gap in the trees, rapidly looking back at me until I'm close enough for him to enter. Then we spend an hour or so walking that trail. I usually check my phone and answer emails during this time while Rex plays in the leaves. We've walked this trail so frequently that I know most of the surrounding area by heart. About a quarter mile to the west, the trail lets out to a small city park. To the north, through the brush, is a small creek. I only know about this because Rex once chased a squirrel through that water. Aside from that, there wasn't much else to the north. The eastern direction is the one that I know the least about. The path seems to extend for quite some time. Rex and I have walked along the eastern path for hours without seeing any indication of an end. Eventually, the time would come for us to head back before it started getting dark out. Then, a week ago, something happened in those woods that Rex and I will never forget. The day started off the same as any other. Rex playfully pushed me awake, and I groggily made my way to the bathroom. After a couple hours getting ready, I checked my schedule and I realized that I didn't have to go into town today. I decided that since I had all this free time, I would spend it walking with Rex instead. I put on my boots and opened the back door. Rex darted out like a bolt of lightning and I followed slowly behind. We pushed our way through the brush and onto the path. I turned right and we began walking towards the east. For the first hour of our walk, Rex ran from one side of the path to the other, sniffing incessantly. While we may have been coming out here every week, it seemed like it was always his first time. The trail began to wind and curve further into the woods. Before I knew it, Rex and I had reached the farthest we had ever gone in this direction. I looked down at him and he returned a look of confused excitement. As we continued onward, I noticed that the trees on either side of us had started to become more and more densely packed together. The previously bright sunlight that scattered through the treetops began to diminish. Only a dull orange glow remained above. My eyes were drifting from side to side, still admiring the scenery until I looked forward down the path. I noticed something was wrong with Rex. He was standing a few yards away from me, completely motionless. I called out to him, but he didn't move in the slightest. I walked a bit closer and saw that he was staring at something off into the woods. I stopped a few feet away and followed his gaze. I thought it might have been a bear or some other large animal that caused Rex to freeze. Standing a couple yards into the woods, between a few of the trees, was a person. A woman, to be exact. She was wearing a white dress which starkly contrasted against her surroundings. She had dark-colored hair that hung loosely in front of her face. At this distance, it was difficult to make out what she looked like. I walked up next to Rex and I called out to the woman asking if she was all right. My voice didn't seem to elicit a response. I turned my attention to Rex and told him that we should probably head back home. When I reached down to pet him, I could feel that he was trembling in place. He suddenly began to back away from where he was standing rapidly. I wasn't sure why until I looked back up to where the woman was. She was now much, much closer to the path. Her appearance was unchanged, but she had somehow closed the distance to us without me hearing a sound. I asked once again if she needed any help, but she didn't respond. An unsettling feeling began to creep in the back of my mind. I told the strange woman that if she didn't need any help that we'd be on our way, before grabbing Rex and we began walking back down the path. After a few seconds, Rex turned and yelped loudly. I spun on my heels and saw that the woman was only a few feet away from us now. This time her head was lifted, and I could see her face. Through the strands of dark hair, I could see that her skin was a pale bluish color. Her jaw, which seemed to be dislocated, dangled towards her neck. Her deeply bloodshot eyes stared at me with an anger like I had never seen before. The sounds of bones snapping echoed from this woman as she raised an arm towards me. When she did this, I felt my instincts kick in and I shouted for Rex to run before I turned to do the same. Rex dashed ahead of me as I struggled to keep up. My heavy boots were slowing my pace greatly, but I just focused on keeping my legs moving. I rounded a long curve in the path before me, and as I did, I glanced back. There was no sign of that woman behind me. At this point, I was oblivious to the log which jutted out onto the path before me. My leg caught it mid-stride, and my head came crashing down into the dirt. I was awoken sometime later to the frantic licks of Rex. My head was pounding, and I could feel a warm sensation coming from the side of my head. Sitting up, I touched my hand to my temple, which came away red. I then began to realize what had happened. I turned to Rex, who looked at me with concern before snapping his head once again down the path. That woman from before was once again standing a few feet away. I tried to stand up, but my disorientation kept me in place. Rex positioned himself between me and the woman. He growled and barked at her angrily. She vanished before our very eyes and reappeared quite a bit closer than before. Rex's barks began to turn into whimpers, yet he still stood his ground. She reached out a withered hand towards Rex, and I felt my body react instinctively. In a flash, I stood up, grabbed Rex by his collar, and pulled him away from her. We both sprinted down that path once again. After a few minutes of running, Rex and I finally emerged from the trees into our backyard. I had never been so happy to see my house before in my life. I collapsed shortly after entering my house and didn't wake up until noon the next day. I don't know who or what that woman was, but ever since then, Rex refuses to go anywhere near our back door. I honestly don't blame him. If any of you out there live near the woods, please be careful. There are things in those trees. Things that you don't ever want to see for yourself.